at FASU since 2021, having been Deputy Director for over 6 years prior to his appointment. Mr. One has extensive experience of regulation and compliance with PNG's financial sector and has represented PNG at regional and international meetings relating to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. Please let's make him welcome. Our next speaker on this panel is Ms. Ruth Kisam Tindui. She is the board chair of Advancing PNG Women Leaders Network. With a Bachelor of Law from the University of Papua New Guinea and multiple fellowships, notably an Obama Fellow, she is a trained community organizer and passionate human rights activist. Her expertise lies specifically in combating sorcery, accusation-related violence, and gendered violence, but she also has a keen interest in greater participation by women in politics as well. So please make her welcome. The third member of our panel is Mr. Richard Whitchurch. He's the Deputy Clerk, Corporate and Support Services within the National Parliament. Mr. Whitchurch has 28 years of experience working in Papua New Guinea's National Parliament, primarily as a lawyer, and he has spent 9 years as acting parliamentary counsel until his elevation to Deputy Clerk in July of 2021. Please make Mr. Whitchurch welcome. You'll see in your program that this panel is on independent from scrutiny. What expectations of accountability should the public have of constitutional officers? In Papua New Guinea, this is always a pertinent question, and we have very distinguished panelists who can speak extensively about this balance between independence and accountability. Specifically, the prompt that we'll be trying to answer over the course of discussion is that the independence of constitutional officers was a key consideration in TIPNG's 2021 National Integrity Systems Assessment, which is available online. This panel will consider the issue that while independence is important to promote national integrity, it also creates the risk of individual impunity by office holders within those independent institutions. So it's an important discussion that we'll be having this afternoon, actually this morning, and we'll also have time for questions towards the end from the audience in the room and those online as well. So if you do have a question online, feel free to enter it into the chat box, and for those in the room, we'll come to the floor for questions towards the end of this panel. As we make a start on the discussion, I think I'll probably start with you, Wilson. It's important just to make sure we have our bearings right. Why is it important that institutions should have a certain level of independence, and what is the process of having this independence for your agency in particular?
Thank you. Firstly, TIPNG, thanks for the invite to speak on this important occasion. The importance of having independent institutions, there can be a lot of reasons, and I can only speak only on behalf of the central bank and some of the benefits that we have enjoyed for some time. But more importantly is that institutions are able to make decisions objectively. I think that's the only one that I can think of and speak to, and without the need to be interfered with or be influenced when decision making. But of course, with having that independence comes with a lot of responsibility, and that must be understood very clearly for institutions that are very independent. And that's where accountability becomes a critical part of your existence as an entity.
And I think your specific unit, the Financial Analysis and Supervision Unit, is also within the independent institution, the Bank of PNG, is also somewhat insulated from the structures that are in there. So would you say that the unit also has some level of independence?
Yes, there is. Administratively, we report to the governor of the central bank. What does that mean? It means that our funding and our operational recruitment and all that is through the bank's normal operations. But however, when it comes to administering the Anti-Money Laundering Act, that power lies or is vested in the director. He or she can make decisions under the AMLCTF Act without the need to consult with the governor.
And so, with this independence that we have, in your view, what would be some of the threats that you have encountered maybe within your agency specifically, or more broadly in PNG? What are the threats to institutional independence?
I think given the way we are structured, the fortunate thing is that, and with some degree of foresight when we developed the AMLCTF legislation, was that in the event that either one of the decision makers is compromised, at least one can stand up to the other, whether it's the director for the Financial Intelligence Unit or or the governor for that matter. But more broadly, based on my own personal observations about the threats to institutional independence, I think I can think of three. One is funding. Funding does have a significant impact on the independence of an institution. When you don't have enough funds to effectively operate, that suppresses your independence as well. Second one is the manner in which appointments are made. I don't need to go into any details of that, but you know what I'm referring to in terms of appointments based on merit. And the fit and proper that needs to be adhered to when appointing these persons for these institutions. The third one is the improper outside influence in decision making through the various direct or indirect relationships that can impede the independence of an institution.
I think those are very clear threats, and I think they're not unique to the financial sector. I think from our first panel, we also heard about some of those concerns that the public service as a whole has experienced. I'd like to turn to Mr. Whitchurch as representative from another independent institution. What does independence mean for the National Parliament, and how do you see it contributing to, let's say, good governance within your institution, but also generally?
Thank you, Yumbari. From my perspective, or from the perspective of the parliamentary service, independence is fundamental to the doctrine of separation of powers. The parliamentary service operates as a separate state service under the Constitution, and it is geared solely towards administering the legislature. Unfortunately, being the Parliament House and the parliamentary service, there is still a lot of contact with executive because they also operate within the same sphere and the same realm. But independence financially is supposed to be guaranteed, much the same as the judiciary, through the provisions in the Constitution, section 209 and 210. But again, that is not always the case. We are always required to take our budget to the executive for them to agree on and then give us the money, and most often they set ceilings for us, which may not be what we require. We may require more than that, but that is what we are given. So sadly, that's one of the realities that we have.
I can see the similarities in terms of the threats that you have both identified. But why is this independence important for the National Parliament in particular, and the parliamentary services? Why should it be an independent? What is the intent in the Constitution of having independent institutions like yourselves and others?
Well, as I said, it is fundamental to the separation of powers doctrine. Aside from that, the independence for the parliamentary service itself allows us to focus more on the administration of the legislature to ensure that their principal role of legislation, well, making legislation, not so much policy but more of legislation, is upheld as per the constitutional requirements. I think essentially that is what our primary responsibility is, aside from making sure that the other things such as remuneration and that sort of thing for the members of parliament and other constitutional office holders is done through such bodies as the Salaries Remuneration Commission, through the Secretariat. Yeah, I think.
And I think in terms of the independence of constitutional offices, it's also important to reflect on what we mean by the constitutional offices. And so we have, for instance, the Bank of PNG, National Parliamentary Services. There are other institutions as well. We have, I think, representatives in the room, for instance, from the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. We have representatives from the Office of the Public Prosecutor. So these are offices that are set up independently in the Constitution and have been given some level of separation from external influences to be able to fulfill their constitutional mandate. When we discuss this broader range of constitutional offices that are independent, Ruth, what does the public entry point into criticizing maybe or engaging with the work of these institutions when they fall short of the expectations that the public has? What are the entry points that we have had in your experience, and are they sufficient?
Thank you, Yua. And thank you, TI, for inviting me as part of the civil society to be part of this conversation. The civil society holds public offices to account. Constitutional offices, they are also part of this very important mechanism that needs to be held to account. And it's important that questions are asked. We ask these questions because we're the ones that are helping the government to implement a lot of these policies that affect the lives of people. A lot of us are grassroots organizations. A perfect example. About 4 months ago, or 3 months ago, my group were doing a election observation of women candidates in 3 provinces. One in one of the extreme, we decided to choose the Southern Islands, the Central, and NCD. And so we followed only women candidates. One of the things that held us up was the way in which constitutional officers that were responsible for the election was actually getting back to us in how we were supposed to do it. We were trying to work together, and our questions went begging in a lot of the instances. And in this case, if we keep our mouth shut, how do we now work together to make these kind of systems work? Because in our working, we realize that a lot of these systems are broken. It's when public starts criticizing, public starts talking about it, it brings to attention what needs to be done. This is also part of collaboration. It's also part of us engaging with the public in such a way that we bring about the changes that needs to be made so that systems work.
And thank you for sharing the experiences about the recent elections that we had. I think one of the main ways that civil society is able to get its voice heard is through the media. And they are often at the forefront of holding public institutions, independent institutions to account. In your engagements, how have you seen the media fulfill that role in PNG specifically?
Media has been very helpful, and that's the thing that we really need to keep the independence as well and protect that the space that media has. I think Papua New Guinea is very lucky that we have a media that is, they're free to be able to publish what they see, but lately it's also been a challenge to see that a lot of what needs to be done, especially around investigating, getting reporting that goes to the heart and the core of having dialogues, prompting dialogues like this, forums like this, asking questions, and even questions that are going back in. We're seeing reports that are being taken or given as what is happening. It's just story. This is what is happening. Someone is being arrested, someone is doing this, someone is doing that, and that's it. What's the story behind that gets to the heart of it, makes us ask those hard questions? What is happening? Who's now stepping over someone else's feet? Where are the separation of powers? I mean, I'm from the civil society sector, so I will not hold back. The recent NAC saga, who's responsible for what? What are the questions we're asking? What is being said about who has the power here? These are the kind of questions that the media needs to ask, because then it also educates our people. When our people are not educated, we're not able to have dialogues that goes to the heart of the problem so that we start fixing it. When our people are not informed, we're not asking the right questions, and this information comes from the media. And as part of the civil society, one of the things that we thrive on is how we disseminate those information. Because when the information goes out, the right information goes out, it helps us with our work, especially in dealing with the people right at the grassroots level. So media plays an important role, very important role.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we should also be empowering the media, and as you say, to protect the spaces that they have in the country. To the two officers from public institutions, when you do have the media knocking down your door and asking you questions about things that are in the news, specifically about independence of your office, maybe Wilson, you did mention that there were some issues recently. How do you engage with the media when they come saying, look, we're representing the people of PNG, we have questions about this process, this appointment, these threats that we might have, be concerned about. What is the appropriate response when you have these kind of questions on the independence of your office?
Thank you. I think it lies in the very fact that when you take up public service and public office or hold public office, you should expect that your decisions are going to be scrutinized, and that every decision you make should have its values embedded in transparency and accountability. And so when it comes to media asking you questions, if you have nothing to hide, you won't worry about answering those kind of questions. That is how I would respond to your question.
And maybe just to play devil's advocate a bit, is it possible to be accountable to the public without succumbing to the risk of being compromised?
Yes, it takes a lot of courage and conviction. And if that is what your institution or you as an individual, as a leader in those institutions strive for, then you will have to make those decisions. And that if you you know that with every decision you make and every action you take, it comes with a lot of responsibility, and you should be prepared to face it.
What about yourself, Richard? Have you had instances where the media have come in and asked questions, and how have you ensured that you maintain the office's integrity, but also respond to public concerns?
I think, Yumbari, in this case, it raises a pertinent question on proactivity and reactivity. When something happens and you start to react to it, obviously that's being reactionary. I tend to think that if you have within your department or your agency or whatever structure you have, a body or an entity that is proactive in its dissemination of information, where you try to counter a reaction by actually going out and feeding the information that you need to the general public, there's less of a reaction later. I say that in the sense that over the last couple of years, the Parliamentary Service has had a media a division set up. We also have our library, which houses our website, and we had a Facebook page. Again, with the Facebook page, that went down because to me, the Facebook page is only reliable where the people that are uploading on it are they're, how should I say, loyal to the Parliamentary Service, and they don't put their own view out. And also the third body that we have there is our outreach body, which is the Civics and Education, which we use to take Parliament to the people, especially to the educational institutions. So my view is that being proactive is better than trying to be reactive when something happens. So I guess in that that would be my position on it.
I think those are really important initiatives, and I should also flag that some of those were done in partnership with TIPNG back in 2013, looking at opening up Parliament or an open Parliament project with funding from the EU at that time. And we're really pleased to note after the launch of the Integrity System Assessment last year, one of our recommendations to have broadcast of Parliament sessions was taken up by Parliament. And so we had Facebook live streaming of the full sessions of Parliament. I think you'll recall that previously we had only had the questions without notice, and then when it came to the bills and papers, no one was being informed about what was being discussed on the floor of Parliament. So definitely there are some spaces for best practice and for reform to come in. But I don't want to stray too far away from our topic, and I want to get back to maybe that topical point that Ruth mentioned about some of the questions in the media about heads of agencies and the investigation. And I'll maybe throw it to Wilson and Richard in your expertise. At what point should constitutional office holders step aside from public office to restore public confidence in that office? Is there a threshold in your experience or in your opinion? And how do we know when they've gone too far beyond that line?
Yeah, it's a very hard one, but I think all public offices or institutions, their existence should be centered around good governance and integrity. And if you know that as a public office holder that your actions or your decisions have somewhat compromised the institution, then you should make that call to save yourself from, to protect the institution, you should make that call to step aside or step down. I think if you ingrain your living or your existence in the integrity of the institution that you serve, you will make that call when it happens that you have made a very poor judgment on some of the decisions you've made, and you should step down. So there is no benchmark for integrity.
But it seems to be a rare occurrence in PNG where the head of an agency, once they have questions come in, would willingly vacate an office. Why is that not more, taken up? Is that because of the structures that we have or the culture, or is it just there hasn't been that precedence where people want to demonstrate that the office is important, it's the people's office, I should step aside? We don't seem to have these kind of instances occurring. Is there any reason, behind that?
There are a whole host of reasons. Some are very, most of it involves personalities. But I think at the first place, when you take up public service, again, it goes back to that very first point that I make. What does it mean to be a public servant? Are you there to serve your own interest, or are you there to serve the people? So if you engrain your existence in your daily service to public service, then when the time comes for you to go, you should go.
What about yourself, Richard? Is there a point where constitutional office holders should vacate office?
In my experience, and the latest experience was in 2014 when the clerk was went before the Constitutional Rights Tribunal. That is the first of its kind where a constitutional office holder was taken before a tribunal. Fortunately, we haven't had too many of them, but Mr. Conivaro, did a judicial review of that decision, and it was found that it wasn't initiated properly in the first place. So on those grounds, he was reinstated. So as far as I know, there's still been no real decision on a constitutional office holder. But in terms of if you are a constitutional office holder and you are taken to task, well, by rights, you really should step aside. That would be the most normal and natural thing to do as you await whatever court process to be finalized, yeah.
And I think going back to Ruth, have you had instances in your experience where you've seen constitutional office holders who have had issues raised against them retain office, and what was your impression of that, and how did you engage on that issue?
Going back to what Mr. Onia said, I read somewhere that there's a standing order for, I think a Senate somewhere in the US that said the ideal concept of public office expresses the words, a public office is a public trust. It signifies that the office holder or the officer has been entrusted with the public power by the people, that this officer holds this power in trust and to be used only for the benefit of the people and not for themselves or anything like that. And if and when that is compromised, it goes without saying they should step down. That should not be two ways about it. In Papua New Guinea, people keep saying there are two laws, one for the big men and one for the small people. So miplo liklik lain, miplo kat low blow miplo, low blow country. Low blow big pla line, they can circumvent it however they want. So it frustrates a lot of people in the public, in the community. Tukina still man, police are belting 2 million still man. Member go through law. Can way blame stop, back door, front door, window, and all get a road blame stop. And this is where a lot of us, especially community, it gets to the heart of the problem. What is the rule of law? If there's one for the big people, then, and if there's one for the small people, then where's the one that combines us or holds us both to account? We have people that we work with that are being taken to task, and they have this, or the minister is going to say this or do this. And again, that also goes to the heart of the problem. When you have political influence overrides the administrative powers, where's the separation? It's not to point fingers at anyone, but if we don't individually take to account that this is where, even if I have too much power, I must, for the sake of the rule of law, hold back and allow the system to take place. If we do that, the system will grow, it will be strong. Right now, people look at us and they're like, we don't have any rule of law. How many people have we tried to bring to court to prosecute under sorcery accusation? I can tell you there's the numbers on one hand, less than that. We've had convictions, we've had prosecution. I don't know whether it's the problem, or I know where the problem is. Sometimes it's because the implementers of this robust law that we have in Papua New Guinea, Papua New Guinea has a very robust law. And maybe some of the other lawyers can correct me on this. We've over-legislated as well. Probably one of the countries in the Southern Hemisphere that has so much laws. And yet we're not implementing some of them. We passed last year the Glassman Act. Before that, in 2015, we amended the Constitution on, the Criminal Code, Section 299A, to repeal the Sorcery Act of 1973, packed everything under the Criminal Code, and to this day, we still can't get prosecution and convictions. That goes to the heart of what is wrong, the implementation of a lot of these laws that we have. And when we are asking people, why can't simple people step down? When you're looking at those that are running around, the criminals that are running around, that also adds to the problem. So when you ask, why can't people just step down when they know they've done something wrong? It speaks to the core of us as a nation. This is called the Integrity Summit. Where is values when Papua New Guineans look at ourselves? What are the values that we hold dear? The values that will make me question, if someone says you've done something, I'll step aside just because I need to protect myself, not fight, not go to court, not call my minister friend, not call the prime minister and say, please, you've got to rescue me. That's where we are.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that's a really important point to stress, and I like that wording of it, public offices and public trust. Before we go to the room for questions, and if you're online watching, if you have any questions, feel free to type in your questions in the chat function as well. I think it's also important to look at what could be done and what are some of the ways that we can maybe improve this poor state of affairs. And before I take questions from the floor, I'd like to ask you, Ruth, how should heads of constitutional offices and constitutional officers themselves engage with civil society to promote accountability? If you had a wish list of what they could do, what would you like to see?
My first wish list would be civil society is our friends. they're here to help you implement the laws that you pass in Waigani. These are the people, the headless chickens that gets to implement them down. Because the system is broken. There's this huge gulf between what's happening at the national level versus what's happening at the subnational and then the local level. We've got the DDA in the middle. But again, that's also a challenge for civil society sometimes. But what we, as the civil society, try to do as much as they can on the ground, we don't get a lot of funding. And I'd like to point back something back to you. When you talk about accountability of our office holders, I'd like to also talk about the accountability of development partners. If you're in the country and you're working with our government, but if there is no policy to hold you to account, what do you do? What is the integrity? What do you do that makes you accountable not only to the government, but to the people and to your people back home, that the taxes that you get or the fundings that you get to be able to help with the government. If a country, you know that they don't have strong mechanisms in place to hold you to account, then what is it? European Union has funded this to set this up to say, look, let's have this conversation. So I'm not saying others need to do this, but this is also a question and a call. We have a lot of money that are going into certain spaces in Papua New Guinea. Now, it was about a month ago we had this, CIMC held a meeting with DNPM and invited civil society to have a voice. And in one of them, to develop, MTDP4. And we realized that we only have a policy that is to work with the development partners. It's not a strategy. So that means that there is no accountability mechanism in place to see how much goes into the WASH program, how much money is spent into GBV, how much money is actually aligned with our 2050 vision. So while we call on our government, our public offices, when you're looking at money, that's where the root of, our good book says, that's the root of all evil. So when monies are coming into this country to work to develop partnership between civil societies and the people and to implement the government's policies, we also need to also ask this question, the integrity between the development partners and our government. What's the conversation that needs to be held there? Because this is very important. The 10 million that the DSIP that members get, as opposed to the money that comes in, is a lot from our development partners. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that. We need to work together so that we don't have a lot of boomerangs that go back and then reports, the fancy reports that gets written up. Civil societies that do the dirty work only get their programs funded. We don't go beyond the stages of being an indigenous NGO because our capacity, our capabilities are not developed. Our government doesn't look at us in that space. But we work with, and we're grateful for that we work with the development partners, but there's got to be accountability there as well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point for the development partners in the room and watching online. I think it's also important to look at how those development partners engage with independent constitutional offices in PNG and to what extent development might also compromise some of the independent functions that those offices have to exercise. I think it's definitely an interesting avenue of inquiry. And before I go to the floor for questions, just to remind you again of the panel topic, and the question we're trying to answer is, what expectations of accountability should the public have of constitutional offices, independent constitutional office, I should say. So if you do have a question from the floor, if you could please raise your hand, we'll bring a mic over to you. If you could just state your name, your organization, and your question. Do we have any questions from the floor? Okay, I can see 2 hands at the back.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Webster. I'm from the National Research Institute. My question is to, obviously a very good panel. There's a lot of issues, but I'd like to direct my question. It's been a burning question for a while to Richard from National Parliament. You correctly pointed out that the role of the legislature is an independent legislator to make laws. And I think in liberal democracies, the other function is to hold the executive government accountable. How much money is allocated to the functions of Parliament in holding the executive government accountable, particularly the work of the committees like the Public Accounts Committee, the appointment committees, and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Webster.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Webster. Yes, as you are quite right, one of the accountability measures within the Parliament system is to have parliamentary committees. And you mentioned, of course, the Public Accounts Committee, which is by far seen to be the most important because it actually oversees and then does the oversight, especially in terms of expenditure of public funds. Now, you've asked what funding is allocated to the committees, I believe, under the parliamentary budget. In my respective view, the parliamentary committee system, which was envisaged under the Constitution, needs to be reworked. The short answer to your question is the committees do not get a whole lot of funding under the budget. Even though on every year we send a budget, it's not one of the priority areas that in my experience. Similarly, the laws governing the committee system are outdated, in my view, and really need to be overhauled. I say that because, again, in my view, the way the system was designed was so that there was, it was a government or pro-government system, because you have a look at the Permanent Parliamentary Committees Act. It makes reference to the chairman, and then the chairman is pro-government. The deputy chairman is pro-opposition, and then they have an alternate chairman who is pro-government. So it doesn't automatically fall that when the chairman is absent, that the deputy chairman will take over the reins. No, in fact, the alternate chairman will take over. And there's also mention in the provisions, including Parliamentary Powers and Privileges Act, mention of a vice chairman, to which I'm lost to what the vice chairman actually is. But that is a system that was designed to try and assist, but over the years it's kind of fallen by the wayside. I say that also in respect of the SRC determinations, because the salary scales now, with the introduction of now 32 ministers, there's a lot less normal members to carry out the roles of the committee, whether they're a committee chairman, a deputy chairman, or a normal member of the committee. And so now that is falling onto the role of the governors now, who are now taking up committee positions, whether they're chairmans, deputy chairmans, and membership. Similarly, from my understanding of the legislation, it's that a chairman could take up 3 chairmanships, but would be paid as a chairman. A deputy chairman could take up to 3 deputy chairmanships and be paid at that level. But now you're finding that a chairman can also be a deputy chairman on another committee, which, in my view, is not what the law envisaged. But again, as I said, my preference would be that whole system is overhauled. But going back to your question, there's not much funding going towards that.
I think I'll just also maybe ask a supplementary question, if I may. I think the opposition also has a function in terms of holding the executive to account. To what extent does Parliamentary Services also support the operations of an effective opposition?
That's an interesting question, because the funding for opposition comes primarily underneath the Parliamentary Service budget. And there is no actual, and in my view, there should be an opposition office, which is fully funded by under consolidated revenue, so that there is staffing there for whoever the opposition is. Right now there isn't. They work out of Parliament. Their funding comes from the parliamentary budget, and you know, I had a conversation with the former clerk, and he said to me one day, he said, why is it that the opposition leader is signing a contract with a consultant, and yet when it comes to paying the bill, I'm the one paying the bill because I'm the one that's got to sign off on the check. And if it's above the threshold that's set down for me in the Parliamentary Service Act, then how can I service this particular contract when I'm not a party to it? And so these are some of the realities that are there. The opposition, in my view, needs to have its own space, and it needs to have its own budget so that they can work within their budget. And as it stands right now, we have some debts from previous oppositions that we're still trying to pay off. So in that respect, their budget comes from within the parliamentary service. And if we get cut, they get cut.
Thank you for those candid thoughts. I think I had a second question from the back as well, so I'll go over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ewa. I'm David Toa. I'm registered in my capacity as an advisor to the Australia PNG Economic Partnership run by Apton Associates. So Ruth, I'll take your comments back to my employer. It's a very good question. But I wanted to make a comment with another hat, and that's as chairman of the central bank. When you have absolute independence and authority, it has to be used properly and effectively. Otherwise, you stand the risk of having your legislation amended. And that's currently the situation that we're undergoing at the moment. We're in stage 2 of the review. So watch this space, because the independence and the impartiality of the central bank is what's really made it the successful organisation that it has been for years. So as we go through these reviews, it'll be interesting to see where things finally drop in terms of what the legislation says or doesn't say around that particular thing, the independence and the integrity of the organisation. Just thought I'd make that comment.
Thank you for that update with your other hat. I think it's useful, and thank you for the commitment with your first hat. I'm sure Ruth will also be following up on that. I think that's a useful point to maybe also go back to Wilson, and just to, one of the things that I had prompted earlier was that FASU within the Bank of PNG is also somewhat independent. And one of the questions we haven't explored is what happens when independent functions within an independent institution might, disagree with the institution itself, and we saw that come to the fore, I think, a year ago. And what was it like navigating that kind of space where you have independent functions within an institution differing from the independent institution? What was that experience like?
Yep, thank you. From our experience in recent years in relation to the differing in views, so to speak, I think it was made easier by the fact that you just go by what the law tells you to do. And as long as you do what the law tells you to do, there is nothing else you should worry about, whether your job is on the line or not. Just do the right thing, what is required, what is expected of you under the law, and you stand by that. And if you know that the decisions you make are in the best interest of the people, you stand by it.
So I think that speaks to the point of a national integrity system, where you have to depend on fair-minded judges, justices that can interpret the law fairly and come up with rulings that are efficient, on time, and meet the requirements in the law. So it points to the need to have these parts of our integrity system adequately resourced so that they can meet the legislative requirements that we had. And I recall from Ruth's earlier comment that we might be over-legislated, but that still means that we're under-practicing with the legislation that we have. And so that therein lies the gap between the practice and the levels of integrity that one would want to see. I want to also look at what could be done in this space. So I think Ruth has already touched on her wish list, and I think, Richard, you've alluded to some of the work that's being done in Parliament. I wanted to go to you, Wilson, if there's, in terms of this accountability and ensuring that the public is on side with your office and with the mandate as you carry out your functions independently, what are some of the steps that you've taken at FASU and that you would recommend for others to consider?
I think, so some of the steps that we have taken include, we normally have staff meetings, and that's a very important avenue where you continuously hound it into staff why you come to work every day and why you are employed and what is the purpose of your institution and what its mandate is for the people. And never forget that every day in your work, you should always be reminded that as a public officer, you are accountable to the people first and foremost. It's when you have personal influences or indulgences that come into play that will cloud your judgment in decision making. And I need not to give you there are many examples of that. Building strong cultures in an institution is very important, particularly around good governance. I also think that we are very beneficial because civil societies and NGOs stand for a cause. And when you have public institutions aligning themselves with those institutions to promote a good cause, it also helps the institution stay on a straight and narrow path as well. And I say that given our experience with the strong relationship we have with TIPNG and other little NGOs, particularly in the illegal logging sector that we engage with, given the kind of work we do. We find those relationships very beneficial to our own existence as well. And also we learn a lot, and it also helps us be very informed about the way we design and develop our guidelines, rules, because you guys are out there and you are on the ground, so our interaction with you helps us make informed decisions as well. We also enjoy the partnership in terms of identifying capacity building programs that we are able to share with you in the civil society as well, and I'm sure TIPNG can speak to that. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Wilson. And that support to TIPNG and others is really important, and we've had, for instance, FASU come along to awareness events as well as outreach events hosted by civil society to communicate the important work that you do. The other aspect of having an independent institution, I'd like to still stay with you, Wilson, is to look at how do independent institutions cooperate amongst each other. And I know, for instance, that FASU leads the work on the national coordinating of the anti-money laundering work that's being done in country. What is your experience of independent institutions trying to collaborate?
It can be challenging, especially when you go to those committee meetings and talk about very sensitive information, and some of those information that you discuss will involve people who are involved in decision making that are part of the committee. So it can be challenging in that sense, but I think at the forefront is always constantly reminding institutions that we should gather as government agencies for a collective good, for the greater good of our people. Having said that, I think one of the expectations of accountability that the public should have on public office, or those that hold public office, is that probably it should be required by law that there should be a public register of your assets if you hold public office.
I think that's a very strong recommendation to end on. We have the requirements under the Leadership Code to declare your assets with another independent body, the Ombudsman Commission, but that's a list that's kept confidential. I think we don't have a publicly available register of interests, and that's something that TIPNG and other actors have also called for to strengthen that public trust. So thank you for highlighting that reform area that we need. I want to also go to you, Richard, in terms of that question of working with other independent institutions that are also mandated to fulfill their own functions. How do you find that level of engagement with Parliament? Is it forthcoming, or do you find yourself very much separate from the other bodies that exist?
No, obviously we are also part of the government of Papua New Guinea, so there is some onus on us and a responsibility to liaise with other bodies, more often than not, bodies such as Ombudsman Commission, albeit because of the nature of the parliamentarians and the leaders that are there. You know, we'll be expecting to work with ICAC when they're up and fully functional. Auditor General, they come in, they audit our books all the time. We expect to work with them. The other part of working with other government departments and agencies is that a lot of them within their legislation have reporting mechanisms where they have to report back to Parliament. And so they bring their reports to the Parliamentary Service, the Clerk's Office, and then from there they are then put out on the floor for tabling and reporting as part of their accountability and integrity process. So yeah, it's incumbent on us to be able to work with anybody and everybody, and so we don't turn anybody away. It's part of our responsibility. So
I think those the tabling of reports by the Auditor General's office and audit reports are really an important part of Parliament's role in fulfilling that accountability mechanism. And I want to come to you, Ruth. We've heard from both Wilson and Richard about how agencies cooperate or independent offices cooperate. In civil society, do you see the linkages working? Are there some linkages between agencies that are stronger than others, and are there ones that could be improved?
We work with a lot of constitutional offices as well as departments. My recommendation would be, it'll be better if there is some sort of data sharing agreement between departments. A clear example of a challenge that we faced in the space of sorcery accusation a few years back. In 2017, there was a budget that was passed. I was with Tribal Foundation at the time. We did a rescue of a 5-year-old girl, and we did a press conference, and about a week later, the government committed more than 10 million into the space of sorcery accusation, gender-based violence, but it was given to a different department. It was given to a department that was the right mandated department, but the strategy for sorcery accusation, the National Action Plan, was parked under a different department. Because there was no collaboration between these two departments, the money sat in that other department and was used for other purpose. While the NGO, the CSOs, and the organizations that were working in the space of SAV, we were going back and we were told to go back and forth the two departments. What really felt unjustified for us was that Yutupla Tupla want them government, Mipla civil society, Mipla helpim Yupla lo walking walk blow, Yupla kind of some highway blow Yupla, pothole start, Mipla go fix him, that's all. How you work between the two of you, get the money to us so that we continue with the strategy of implementing the strategy that you passed. That should not be our problem. And 5 years on, we're still not able to account for what happened to those funds. No, these are the challenges that a lot of civil society we face when it's departments that are supposed to be doing something, government offices. We've got a law that is supposed to sort of bring all the civil society together and form a forum for us so that CIMC can be able to take that ownership. That draft act is sitting somewhere, has been sitting somewhere for the last, 3, 4, 5 years. Again, that's a challenge again. You know, you want to have all these bodies come together to work so that we work with the government. But then when we have departments amongst themselves not able to collaborate, it makes work harder for us. And these are the challenges. And not only that, I think, but we've had some, we've had some grounds taken where the organizations are now coming out to say, how can we work directly with civil society? And this is also very, it's giving us the confidence to see that these are offices, government offices, but then they're also reaching out to civil society to say the work that you're doing is something that we feel that we want to support. And that is also making us, work with other civil society within this space. But more needs to be done. More has been done, but more needs to be done.
And I think those examples are particularly pertinent because they're within, as you say, departments. So they already have that linkages that's supposed to be there in terms of national planning and cooperation. I think it gets to an added level of difficulty when you have independent offices that are mandated by the Constitution with specific functions. And I'm mindful of time, and I'd like to go back to the audience. If you have any questions, I'll come back to the audience, but I wanted to ask you this, Ruth. You mentioned the prosecution of SAV cases, and I think that's a classic example of linkage between two constitutional offices. You have the police that investigates and the Office of Public Prosecutor that prosecutes. How has that relationship worked for you as civil society? Where do you see the systemic issues that could be addressed in that relationship?
One more office is the Department of Justice, where the law is packed. So when you have new laws, how do we disseminate that down to the communities? It's the civil society that actually do that. We work in partnership with the organizations that, like CIMC, we get those laws printed out, we disseminate them, because these are new laws. A lot of people don't realize that 1973 Act of the Sorcery Act was repealed back in 2015. A lot of people don't realize that the criminal code was amended. A lot of people do not realize that we've got the Glassman Act in place now. So because of all of that, the information that is lacking on the ground, a lot of even police, for that matter, who are not aware of these laws, do not know how to place their charges. So when it comes to before the court, when you want to go before the court, it's thrown out because you've got them under charges that are not relevant to what they did. So they are pleading not guilty. I didn't do this because I'm not charged under the right act. These are the kind of challenges when there's no collaboration between the Department of Justice, where the law is packed, or DJAC, sorry, and then you have the prosecutor who are not so well versed about how to put those charges. And then you have the police who just wants to get out there and just arrest them and bring them in. But when it comes to being able to do up the paperwork properly, it doesn't get done. And again, that also adds to the challenge that we're having. The one part, I'd like to mention this, there is a desk within the police department, the Family Sexual Violence Unit, the FSVU. That is a very important a space for us, the civil society, to work with. Sadly, it does not have a structure. So it is like just a desk that is attached. So they don't have a structure, no point of command, and that needs to be done. Because if that is done, then it gives us, the civil society, a direct link into the police, so we don't disrupt the work. We go straight to them, report our cases, work with them to get arrest if need be, prosecution if need be, and all that. But because that is just a desk that was set up, even though it's in 49 spaces, it's fully funded by development partners. Thank you to the Australian government in the first place to help with our government to set this. It's not a department, it's just a desk within the police department, the FSVU. But that needs a structure. The police department needs to give that a structure, give that a command, so it makes it easier for the police, civil society to engage directly with the police so that we start to get our works out of the way.
Thank you. I see a question from the floor, so I'll take one in front, and I'll come to you at the back, sir. So first question in front.
I wonder if you could...
Sorry, if you could introduce yourself. And
sorry, Anthony Regan, I'm from the ANU. Used to be UPNG or NRI. But I'm wondering about reduced effectiveness of independent constitutional officers. There's perhaps a rundown in effectiveness of public institutions generally, which is understandable, but there seems to be a particular problem with some of the independent office holders. And I wonder if it's partly a funding issue, because of course, although there's a constitutional duty for government to fund constitutional officers, they don't have a guaranteed budget. And so I noticed in the Integrity Systems report last year, very lumpy financing, for example, for the Ombudsman Commission, high one year and incredibly low the next year. So very hard for an institution to be effective if it doesn't have assured funding. You've got a lot of pushback, for example, against the Ombudsman Commission over a number of years now. Government moving and committees moving to reduce the powers of the Ombudsman, which puts a lot of pressure on the Ombudsman. You've got a provision in the Constitution that allows the Ombudsman and a number of other constitutional officers to take cases to the Supreme Court for interpretation of the Constitution and the application of the Constitution. But the Supreme Court, in a couple of cases now, has expressed concern that the constitutional officers are not doing that to the extent that they used to. And so there's less effective monitoring of how well the Constitution is working and whether laws being made by Parliament and policies enacted by the executive are constitutionally valid. For example, in the case that Ila Geno launched several years back, where he successfully challenged the very long grace period for motions of no confidence after the election of a Prime Minister. It had been extended from 18 months to 30 months from memory. The court overruled it and allowed Ila Geno to launch the case and said the constitutional officers are asleep at the wheel, and so we'll have to allow private citizens to take cases. So is this a picture of reducing effectiveness of the independent constitutional office holders, or am I being too negative?
Yeah, I think that's a good intervention by Mr. Regan there. And I take your point about the role of the Supreme Court also as a way of enforcing constitutional mandates and holding those officers to account, and then the failure of those officers to actually trigger those processes. I think if I can maybe shape the comment and the intervention into a question that our panelists can speak to the point on reduced effectiveness of constitutional officers. You've touched on the budgetary allocations, and that was a threat that both of our representatives identified as well. I know that Parliament has maybe more of a secure budget because of the appropriations bill for Parliament. But have you seen, for instance, in FASU and with your partners within the National Coordinating Committee, that independence and effectiveness of those independent institutions eroding over time, or is Mr. Regan being overly pessimistic?
Thank you. I can only say that some of us are fortunate enough because we come from an institution where it's self-sustained. So we don't envy our colleagues from the other government agencies where they depend heavily on the government budget on an annual basis. So we do see the challenges they face on a yearly basis in terms of their budget constraints and how it has had an impact on their ability to effectively function. But we try our best to support them in simple ways. Say, for example, if it comes to hosting a meeting, we don't have the expectation that our colleagues will find the money to host us. We go ahead and do it for the good of everyone else. Or even simple things like buying stationeries and supplying it to those offices, just to keep them going. So yeah, it's a constant challenge for institutions, particularly law enforcement agencies.
And maybe just to put the point forward, is it a deterioration or has it always been this case?
I can't say whether it's deteriorating, but on a yearly basis, it's the norm that we have seen. We're hoping that will improve. Yeah.
Yeah, Richard, do you have a view on that question? Do you find that you have more protection if you have your own appropriations bill and you're less insulated from the pressures of arguing your case in the consolidated budget?
Well, as I said, the legislature, or at least the parliamentary service, has its own budget similar to the judiciary. Doesn't mean we always get what we ask for. As for the question on whether it's deteriorated, I'd actually be sympathetic to that view, that there has been over time deterioration. I say that in this sense that what you would regard as the norms and the action plan for, say, 2 decades ago has over time changed, and now maybe they're not so, maybe for instance the Ombudsman is not so focused now on what it used to be 20 years ago, as with the introduction of ICAC and things like that. Similarly, I give an example of members of parliament who their primary role is as legislators. But you find now with the advent of the DSIP and the DDA Act and things like that, they're shifting to, and you know, it's been said that they're now more project managers than they are members of parliament, essentially. It's not being derogatory in any way. They've changed their focus now on what it is that they believe that they're supposed to deliver. So maybe over time it has deteriorated to some extent.
Again, thank you for your candor. I think we had a question from the back, and then we have one in the front. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Olugbenga Ige, NRI. During the discussions, held in panel 2 yesterday, I think Martin moderated or was the rapporteur for that session, and I can see Anthony is here. Sydney mentioned the Sovereign Wealth Fund, regarding PNG. So, and you know, from the experiences and the manner in which the sovereign wealth funds of different nations were actually administered, I find it expedient to actually ask that this question specifically goes to Wilson and Richard, that does the public in PNG, you know, has a working knowledge of the amount of that fund allocated to stabilization fund, the amount allocated to infrastructural development, the amount of the sovereign wealth fund in PNG, you know, allocated to future generations, and the amount of the sovereign wealth fund in PNG, you know, that remains unallocated to meet, some unforeseen economic situations. Now, the reason why I'm actually asking this question is that, you know, constitutional offices or whoever is managing that fund must know that they must be accountable, you know, to the public in terms of the distribution of the sovereign wealth fund that has been put in place. Now, sovereign wealth fund thrives majorly in countries where their economy is, you know, commodity centered. And how do I mean? If you look at the top 7 nations in the world that have successful sovereign wealth fund models, most of them, they are commodity, you know, focused economies. And the only 2 in the top 7, you know, that are non-commodity focused economy happens to be Singapore, not far from us, and China. So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Russia, and, you know, some other oil-based economies, of course, they've managed these funds successfully. And lastly, in PNG, are there structures, you know, that takes care of political considerations that will allow this sovereign wealth fund, you know, to have a kind of long-term equity for national development as well as the local market. And the reason why I'm asking the second question is I know of a particular nation that put together the sovereign wealth fund in 2004. And from 2004, you know, till about 2017, that nation saved $2.2 billion. So in 2017, you know, another government came on board and withdrew $1 billion from that $2.2 billion. So as of January 2022, the amount remaining from that $2.2 billion, was just $35 billion. And they withdrew this $1 billion, you know, to buy arms and ammunition and other related equipment for the military, which was never part of the original, you know, subset that funds were actually allocated to in that sovereign fund. So I'll be delighted if we can shed more light on this, and, you know, if the public doesn't have, you know, the distribution kind of knowledge on how the sovereign wealth fund in PNG is actually distributed, what steps can we take to ensure, you know, the public is actually aware of what these funds are meant for? Thank you.
Thank you, our colleague from NRI, for that question. I know it also relates to discussions that happened in panel 2 of day 1 yesterday that was looking at public and private sector governance. I note that the moderator for the session is also in the room and one of the panelists is here, so I'd also invite you to maybe speak with them. This is one of those questions that's, as a moderator, is really difficult because it's a tempting question that I would like to speak to myself, but I have to defer to my panelists and to ask them to enlighten our audience. And I know it was a multi-layered question. I think the crux of the question was, what is the level of public understanding of how funds are allocated, and specific funds like the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We had an update from our colleague Sydney yesterday from KCH that they had allocated a significant amount of money to that fund from dividends that had been paid to KCH. So that's the context of the question. But more broadly, what would you say are the public understandings of how constitutional officers allocate spend funds, with an eye on the risk that if we're not aware of it and there is a change of government, we might suddenly have a drawdown and, you know, end up funding things that were not intended for by the establishment of the fund. So what are public understandings of how constitutional officers expend funds? I'll go to Wilson as our financial representative. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me digest this, but let me just say, let me qualify myself. I'm not really privy of the details of this, only because just because I'm from the bank doesn't mean that I know what other divisions within the bank are doing. My specialty is anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. So it would do injustice for me to try and be so-called expert in that area, so to speak. I'm happy to take your questions offline and refer you to the people in the bank that deal directly and have intimate knowledge of this setup to answer your question, so to speak. But if you ask me what my personal view is, I would have preferred that the Sovereign Wealth Fund should have been set up a long time ago. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I think just to make sure, our colleague TIPNG has done extensive work on the Sovereign Wealth Fund as well. And so we have resources available on our website explaining some of our concerns about the establishment of the Sovereign Wealth Fund and some of the recommendations that we've had for the incoming government as well around the Sovereign Wealth Fund, how it's set up, how it's monitored, and how it makes its decisions on spending. So there's some literature that's out there, and happy to speak with you during lunch. I think we had one more question in front, and then I'll have to come to the end of the session. So we'll have the gentleman in front, please.
Thank you. Anthony, I am not representing any particular organization here in a personal capacity. Just very quickly on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, hasn't been operationalized yet. Number of enabling legislation, consequential amendments still need to be made. So the Secretariat hasn't been set up in the Bank of PNG as well. So and the board has not, board directors have not been appointed either. Just a question, perhaps. I noted the SRC was mentioned, and so I just wanted to ask a question about that, just about its independence. So we know that the Salaries and Remuneration Commission report, the 38th report, was presented to the last sitting of the last Parliament, and once that's accepted by Parliament, the recommendations contained within the report come into force. And so I note that the Commission, the members of the Commission are essentially all leaders, and the Commission determines leaders' pay. And by leaders, that's both elected leaders as well as appointed leaders. So I think 2 secretaries sit on the Commission as well. And I think one of the things about constitutional office and the independence is to allow them to make objective and impartial decisions. And so I noted that SRC, it recommended and it was approved by Parliament, a 7.5% increase in pay for leaders. So that's both parliamentarians as well as heads of bodies funded by public money. 7.5% for the period 2016 to 2019, and then 5% for 2020 to 2023. And so I noted in the newspaper that ordinary public servants did not get a 5% increase, they got a 3% increase. So I was just wondering, just in terms of scrutiny of SRC, who does that? And it's particularly hard for Parliament to do that when they're considering matters quite relevant to them. And I just wonder whether you had any thoughts. Probably to Richard. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. The SRC is mandated under Section 216, capital A of the Constitution. Its composition is the Prime Minister, the Speaker is the Chairman, the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice, and the Opposition Leader, the Secretary for Personal Management, and the Secretary for Labour and Employment. They're the six that are the primary members. They have their nominees as well who can sit in on their behalf. So, yes, that body is primarily made up of leaders who do decide on what leaders' salaries and allowances should be. There is no real oversight body on the SRC other than the Parliament itself, whereby their report that is done goes before the National Parliament and then presented. And if the Parliament has only two things that it can do: either accept the report, and that's in total, or reject it. And if it rejects it for one small part, then the whole report is rejected. That's the way the situation works as it is. So the judiciary also did get a small pay rise prior to that as well. But the 38th report has been the most comprehensive since the inception of the SRC and the Secretariat. In 2017, the Secretariat was managed by a late Mr. Jack Begita. After his demise, I was asked to oversee that body, and then I've, in that period since 2017, managed to recruit staff to that Secretariat. And then now they're, in my view, up and running. I no longer have anything to do with the SRC Secretariat myself or the SRC, but they came back from Bougainville 2 days ago after going up there to assist with their, to sort out their administrative things. But in terms of oversight, the only oversight is by Parliament on the floor of Parliament. And I think out of 38 reports, there's only been 3 that have been rejected. So you draw your own conclusions from that. I think, I'm not sure, have I answered your question fully? Okay.
I think I'm really grateful to the questions from the floor and to the responses from our panelists. I'm mindful of our time, and we've just come towards the end of our panel. I want to go back to our panelists and really look at this question of independence and accountability. I want to ask each of you, do you think we are where we should be in terms of independence and accountability, that balance? And if not, what would you recommend that we should do as a priority going forward? So maybe I'll start with Wilson first and work my way back. So again, that question, the balance between independence and accountability, is PNG where it should be, or is there more that needs to be done, and if so, what is that?
I think there is a lot that needs to be done at an institutional level and collectively as government agencies. Yeah.
We're a developing nation. Growing pains is part of every developing nation's growth. We're not where we are supposed to be. No country in the world is where they're supposed to be. Everyone has their own challenges. We have our own, but I think it looks for more collaborative approach between the civil society, let me mention, with the civil society and the media. We have so much to do together. We've done so much together. We still have more to do together, but then at the same time holding offices accountable, especially from the civil society sector.
So, thank you, Ruth. I think that's also the intention that we've had with summits like this. I think it's important to have these kind of discussions, and it's important to have those reflections from different stakeholders, because we have to all do this together. I'll leave the last word to you, Mr. Whitchurch.
Thank you. I think personally, there's a lot more work to be done, and You know, for me, as our society gets more and more educated, we find more and more people that are finishing tertiary education and things like that. We can only, in my view, increase and move forward. But personally, I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much. I think we've had a really rich discussion. You'll agree we've spanned a lot of different questions and areas of interest. We started off looking at what the threats are to the independence of our institutions, and we had particularly budget and appointments as being brought to the fore by both our representatives from the independent constitutional offices. We saw a lot of weaknesses that still exist between institutions themselves, between institutions and the chain of linkages that they operate, and also particularly on civil society engagement with those independent offices. But having said that, we saw a lot of space for engagement as well, and we had, particularly from Wilson, that there is a role for civil society to play, and that it actually is welcomed by civil society as well, and Ruth shared their experiences where departments themselves are coming and asking for that engagement so that accountability can be strengthened. I think we had a lot of discussion, particularly around Parliament and its role in accountability, and a lot of discussions that we would not be privy to otherwise. So I thank Mr. Whitchurch for his candor and for speaking very clearly and not evading any of the questions that were put towards him. I think it also opens up a lot of avenue for further advocacy and engagement. So out of this summit, we're hoping that we will have an outcome document that can guide some of the work that could be done by the state, by donor partners, and I acknowledge those that are in the room, as well as civil society actors. So it's definitely, as the panel have said, a space for work. And so I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking them for beginning that work and starting that discussion. Let's give them a round of applause. I'll ask the panelists to remain on stage. We'll just have a photo, and I'll hand back to Ariane.
Thank you, Yua, and thank you to our distinguished panelists as well. We will now be going to a short lunch break, so we will reconvene at 1:30 for the panel 2, with the people, the future of electoral and integrity reforms. For our participants online, we will ensure that we are promptly back by 1:30. And for our colleagues that are here at APEC House, I invite you to join us in the foyer. Thank you.